Hello and welcome. This is another video on SimConnect. In this video, we'll look into how to get taxi path data and what are some of the intricacies that are involved with that. Uh, and with that, let's get into it. First, I'll show you some of the documentation here from the SDK, just to point out why I did things in the way that I did them. As you can see, we're at the SimConnect Add to Facility Definition page. It's a very long page. and, well, I already had a video on how to get airport data, dive into runways, stuff like that. But in this case, for my project for FS runway incursions, I also wanted to dive into taxiways and how to get data out of the sim for that in order to have vehicles move around the airport in a realistic way. If you look at the index here on the side, you can use that to navigate this page a little bit easier. And in this case, if you look down here, this is how you define an airport. Well, let's go there first. An airport has a couple of things that might be useful, like the number of taxi points and the number of taxi parkings and the number of taxi paths. And this already gives away the fact that it's not very easy to get this data or to understand the data that you're going to get, which is the problem I was facing while working on FS runway incursions. Let's have a look at taxi paths specifically. So if you're going to get taxi paths, they have a type. That's pretty self-explanatory, I think. Well, this data we'll get into at a later stage, probably a different video. Taxi paths can be part of a runway. So this is defined if it's part of a runway. Some edge information, well, center line, great. Then we get to start and end. These are integers, and according to the definition, these are index numbers of taxiway points or parking spaces where the path starts from and where the path ends. And they have a value range between 0 and 4,000. So here's a limit on how many path segments you can have in an airport, but okay. If we then take this information, well, let's have a look at a taxi point, for example. A taxi point has a type, again, fine, not a big deal. It has an orientation, well, also fine, and it has an X and a Z. And here comes some confusion in the documentation, in my opinion. So the X, that's fine. A Z, why is that a Z? I was confused. I'd say this has to be a Y and not a Z, but that's just my opinion, because these are points actually from the airport reference along longitude and latitude. So Z to me would refer to an altitude and not a latitude. But okay, as long as you can as long as you read this, you'll be fine, and it's good. But if we go back to our taxi path, we had a start index and an end index that would refer to a taxi point, but these do not have an index. The same goes for parking. So if I go to taxi parking, with a type and a taxi point type, we have a name, but the name refers to an enum. So this is not an index, right? So it's completely different. There's a suffix. Again, this is sort of an enum type thing. This does have a number, but this is the number of the parking place. It's not referred to as an index. And again, the bias X and Z are defined right here. So these are available, but no index anywhere in this definition. So how do you actually make sense of the taxi data? Uh, well, I figured the best way to actually uh, test this and have an ability to work with this and see if I can test out different theories on this was to create a tool that would visualize the taxi data for me. So that's what I did. First, I'll give you a short demo, and then uh, once that's done, we can look at some code. So I'll start the tool. I have the sim running in the background. It's just in the main menu, which is fine for what we're trying to do here. So the tool will start up. There we go. I'll just make that full screen. Let's get a simple airport just to get started. We'll do Lelystad Airport because, well, I'm very familiar with that airport. And if we load the airport, here we go. This looks cool. So here's the runway down the center, this red line, which is also a taxi route. Um, well, uh, there's some parking area over here that will serve as these taxi routes, but these are the main general aviation taxi routes with the museum here on the end. So yeah, this works very nice. And this black dot here is a vehicle parking spot. This orange thing is a vehicle road. So yeah, this looks really good. And we can even use a larger airport. Let's do Schiphol. Load that up. And here we go. This is Schiphol. For those of you who are not familiar with the airport, we have a couple of runways. These are, well, I guess let's call it 36 left, uh, 36 center, and 36 right. And, well, 09, something like this is 24 and 27. So pretty cool. Little taxiways around it, some vehicle parkings, and some orange vehicle roads. Like so, this is really cool, and this really works very well. So how do you do this? Because it's, well, from the documentation, not that obvious. So let's look at some code. I'm gonna shut this down, wait for it to return to normal, and then let's look at some stuff that we did. We'll start with the sim DLL, the simulator class, because that's probably the easiest and the most useful for you guys. And we'll start with how to get the definitions right. Looking for the right function, register facility data. And as you can see, this function is getting quite long, but yeah, I figure still all needs to be in the same place. From previous videos, you might remember that you need to open certain objects. This starts an object for the airport, and then we get some airport data right up to here, some open runway. We'll skip the runway data, close the runway, and then here we get to the interesting stuff. We do an open taxi point. In this case, we want the type, the by is X and Z, and that's it. And for the taxi parking, pretty much the same. Um, and then for the taxi path, I wanted to type the width, all the width data, and the runway data, the start, the end, and then we close the taxi path, and then we're done. This is very easy, very straightforward stuff. If you've worked with SimConnect before, you should be familiar with this. The same goes for registering the structs to receive this data in. I registered 3 new structs, one for a taxi point, a parking, and a path. Well, we can have a look. If I go here, it's basically an integer for the type and floats for the bytes X and Z. The same goes for the taxi parking. And then for the path, we have an integer for the type, floats for the width, integers for the runways, and integers for the start and the end. Again, this is not very complicated. You can get most of this from the documentation, and from some experience with SimConnect, you will figure this out. So this is the easy bit. So in order to retrieve the facility details, we have this function in our simulator class that's get facility details. You put in an IKO code as a string, and then it calls request facility data on the SimConnect object. We pass in the data definition that we want, and we pass in the data request and the ident, the IKO code. The simulator will then start giving us data, and it, as you may have remembered from previous video on facility data, it will do that in not in one go, but in chunks of data. So I'm gonna go here, and you will get events on receive facility data. Now, if you look at this function, well, you may have seen this before in the previous video. We split up to read data in various ways to fill the various structs. We'll skip the airport, the runway. That's not interesting. And we'll look at the other functions. So we have a taxi point details function. This reads the taxi point details. We'll loop through the data elements that we have, which is an object array, and we'll cast it into the registered struct for this specific data, which is a taxi point details definition. And then from that, we can construct whatever data we want to expose to our tools. In this case, we want to create a taxi point object. We're going to get a location, which is a geolocation clause that we've been using throughout this series. And we actually calculate it by getting an offset based on the airport location. We had the airport in an earlier stage. So if you register it in a certain order, you're going to get the details in this order. So that's really useful. And we're going to get the bias X and Z, which is, as you may recall from earlier in the video, this is the reference. This is related to the location. So from the airport location, you can actually get the geolocation for this point, which is useful. We're going to get an index. This is a function get new taxi point index. We're going to have a look at that later. And then we'll set what kind of a type this is, which is an enum that we defined that we can do a peek on so that you can see what it looks like. These are basically just the values in the same order as they are in the documentation, which means they get the same int values that we get from the sim. So that's very useful. And then once we've done that, we'll add the taxi point to the taxi points list that we have on our airport details class. And then we're done. We'll look at parking, which is very similar. Just a different struct. Again, we'll calculate a location for each of them, and we'll call get new taxi point index. Note that we do the same index generation for taxi points and taxi parkings. We'll cast the enum, and the point type is set to none. And that's it. It's added obviously to the taxi points. And that's pretty much it. And then there is the path details. The path details is slightly more code, but it's not that big of a deal. What we try to do here is to get the start point for each of these taxi paths. And we do that by just looking at taxi points and getting the taxi point based on the start index and the endpoint, we do the same thing, but we use the end index. And these get us taxi points. And these taxi points we've calculated locations for, so we can actually copy the location data. We also keep track of the start index and end index for troubleshooting if this is correct or not. And then we have our airport details taxi paths added, right? So we add a new instance right straight here. So how do we get these indexes correct? Because, well, we don't get them from the sim. So how do we do that? If we go back to, let's say, in this case, taxi parking details, you notice this function, get new taxi point index. And it's defined right here. First thing we do is if we do not have any taxi points, we just return 0, because which might be if your airport details is not there or you don't have any taxi points, well then this returns 0. We don't want it to crash on that or throw an exception because we don't have the airport details. If we do have airport details, note that if we do have airport details and we do have taxi points, then we can call a max on the index for these taxi points. So each taxi point already has an index. Because we assign them using get new taxi point index. So basically, if there's no taxi points, the first taxi point gets 0 because there's no taxi points, and then after that we get the max. So then the first taxi point was added, it has a max of 0, and we just add 1 to it, and we return 1, and then it just keeps incrementing. So now that we have an index defined, basically this just counts any taxi point or parking coming in and just assigns them an incremental index. And that works. So that's really just how it's done. I really don't understand why Microsoft did not put that in the documentation or a SOO, because that would have made life so much easier just knowing that you can just increment them, or they could have supplied an index themselves as they serve them out. But yeah, it made things quite complicated. But now we can actually get access to really cool taxi point data. I'm not going to go through all the code for the visualization of this because it's, well, I don't think it's that relevant for SimConnect development. However, if you feel that the visualizer is a useful tool to you, please leave a comment below, and well, I might just make it available for you to use and troubleshoot, and might even open source the code. So just let me know if that's something you would like to see, and then I'll look into that. That being said, it would really help me if you leave a like or subscribe to the channel, and I hope this was useful to you, and I'll see you next time.